Hello friends! With us knowing we'll be heading off to Sharlayan this November with Endwalker, I thought it'd be fun to go over the lore and history of this enclosed city-state. Though please be aware that this is the lore and what we know of the city-state so far. I have no doubt a lot is going to change as we uncover and learn more about the city-state through Endwalker. But I still thought it would be fun to talk about this great city-state regardless. The city of aggressively peaceful scholars. They who placed the Holy Helix, a spiral shell on their flag. Time to talk about Sharlayan. So, to talk about the city, let's start with how the city came to be, their history. To learn of the founding of Sharlayan, we must go back to the 6th Umbral era. Specifically, we must talk about the calamity that ended that era, the calamity of water. During this time, 12 legendary figures appeared, those who would become known as the 12 Archons. These people saved numerous lives during the calamity through their actions. One of these Archons was a huge Rugadin named that, who hailed from the Northern Empty, specifically from the Isle Sharlayan now resides on. He was an incredibly powerful mage and foresaw the calamity through astrology. He was unable to sit idly by while people died, so he made a great ship of wood and set upon a voyage to Eorzean with a crew of volunteer sailors. Along their way to Eorzean, he and his crew rescued numerous people from the waters and torrents, pulling people out of the raging waters and stopping on any landmass that existed to bring people on board. Alas, as they drew closer and closer to Eorzean, they saw a tidal wave bearing down upon them. A massive thing that stretched from one horizon to the next. Knowing this would destroy his vessel and signal certain death for all on board, decided to gamble on a teleportation spell. He cast an ancient and incredibly powerful spell on the vessel, but had zero idea where they'd be teleported to. Maybe they'd end up in Eorzean, maybe they'd end up in the Far East, or maybe they'd end up on top of a mountain in the Abalanthia's spine. Yeah, from one problem right into another. They were safe from the waters, but now, instead of potentially drowning, they may potentially die of hunger. You see, most people who boarded the ship pretty much brought nothing but the clothing on their backs, so their meager supplies very quickly ran out. And as these people became more hungry, their humanity vanished. They became little more than savage beasts, fighting and killing each other for what little scraps they could find in the peaks. Nyankref watched from upon his ship, his heart filled with grief and despair. All the lives he worked so hard to save are now slaughtering themselves. He decided that he and those who would follow him should not tarry in this region, and as soon as the calamity rains stopped, he led his followers down the mountains, across Eorzean, and to the Dravanian hinterlands, where he built a new ship. They then sailed west and safely reached the isles that called home. With all those new people on the island, they set about building a new settlement, a humble village that followed Nyankref's teachings, to forever renounce war and walk in the light of wisdom and reason, valuing knowledge and understanding above all things. Their motto became, "Knowledge seeks no man." This village was founded in the year 10 and was the start of the great city-state of Sharlayan. Sharlayan today has a territory stretching over all 3 islands in their archipelago. The central isle is where the actual Sharlayan city exists. They also have the northern isle of Ham, the eastern isle of Yawning, and used to have a southern isle named Val, but it kinda decided to just wander off and vanish during the 7th Umbral Calamity, and later popped up somewhere in the Far East and became the Isle of Eureka. So Sharlayan now only has 3 islands. To this day, the Sharlayans keep the teaching of
Ducreux
as closely as possible. Thus, Sharlayans want to gather all the knowledge of the world and preserve it for posterity. They covet the unknown and the unexplored, desiring to understand and know all things. But, note, so that they can know all things. They will decide what to share with others. This is because, just like in the teachings, the Sharlayans abhor bloodshed and war. They see fighting as a thing only barbarians do, and the idea that their knowledge could potentially be used for martial purposes sickens them. Thus, any knowledge that may potentially be dangerous or deadly is guarded closely in order for it not to be used. So really, the influence of the teachings of
Nymph
on Sharlayan cannot be understated. From their culture to their world views to even their government, Sharlayan is a good old democracy. However, when their numbers were far fewer and when
Nymph
was around, all adults would gather together in what they called the Ecclesia. Side note, this is a fantastic word. Not only is it really fun to say, Ecclesia, but it's also what a political assembly of citizens in ancient Greece was called, where they'd come together and talk about any important matters to them, which is exactly what the Sharlayans are doing here. But anywho, as time passed and the Sharlayans' numbers grew, there became just too many people for an orderly gathering. At first, they tried their best to maintain all adults in the meetings as taught, but this ended in failure. Regardless of what they did, it was always just too disorderly. Imagine a room full of screaming airplane babies. Now sprinkle in a few Karens who think all the other Karens are managers. That's roughly the pain and chaos these meetings were. So, because of how disorderly it was, they established a new type of government that mimicked Nymphrep's teachings as close as possible. They said, instead of letting literally every citizen into our government, let's establish a voting system where all Sharlayan citizens of age would cast a vote to elect members of their peers into one of the 99 seats of government. They would vote for the officials who they feel, quote, best represent the will of the people. You know, this system sounds very familiar. We call it a parliament, specifically the House of Commons. It totally doesn't have any problems and works 100% of the time. Fun fact, originally the Sharlayan government would actually meet up in an open public square so that all citizens could listen to the proceedings. This public square was called the Forum, and that's how their government got their name. Beyond that, the forum is basically the House of Commons part of a government. Anywho, the speaker of the forum, that is, the member of the forum with the most support by his fellow members, serves as the head of state, but his power is, quote, greatly restricted by law. But he also kinda makes the laws, so you know.
I never broke the law! I am the law! Law!
Let's talk about the leader. We don't yet know who the current leader is, but we know that Sharlayan has no permanent leader like the other city-states. And I'm assuming from the trailer, the game, and the lore books that the current leader is probably Fortunat Levenir. So let's talk a bit about him. He is, quote, the eldest son of the great Archon Louisoix Levenir, meaning he has siblings or a sibling we don't yet know about. Fortunat is known to hold the teachings of with high regard and has followed it diligently for all his 40 years. Thus, he sees war as something only done by barbarians. Due to this, he has had quite a few scoffs with his father and children. Nonetheless, even though he despises that his father and children would go to Eorzea, interfere with events, and, well, go to war, he also respects people's right to make their own decisions and forge their own paths. Thus, he did not attempt to stop his father or his children in their choice. And, as with the entire Levenir family, he is a very talented mage and highly intelligent, though clearly not intelligent enough to not piss off the Warrior of Light by disowning his children in front of them and in front of another city-state leader, making him look like a gigantic ass in the process. Most unwise, my man. If Dulia Chai hears of this, I swear she'll rip a hole straight through dimensions through sheer motherly anger just to smack him. Anywho, back to Sharlayan. So what made this tiny village into the city-state powerhouse it is today? Let's talk about their industry. The power of Sharlayan can be attributed to three great industries. Firstly, their aetherical technology. The Sharlayans have studied aether and magic for many, many years. They first discovered how to construct new aetherite in the year 598 and performed the first successful aether travel 7 years later in 605. Years later, in 902, the city-state of Beladia and Sharlayan signed an agreement, where the first aethernet was crafted in Beladia by the Sharlayans, and Beladia would have to constantly pay for its use. Soon after this, the other city-states followed suit and had their own aethernets constructed. Thus, the Sharlayans invented the aethernet, and it is they who established, maintain, and get paid for the use of the entire Eorzean aethernet. So, really, a pretty dang good source of income considering how lazy the Eorzean adventurers are. That is way too far away to walk. There we go. Much better. By the way, the Sharlayans can turn off the Eorzean Aethernet at any time they want. This was actually done once in the year 965. They turned off the entire Fanland Aethernet until the Beladier Civil War ended. Their second and third industry is books and education. I'm sure this comes as no surprise. The city-state values knowledge and the expansion of knowledge. Thus, they naturally have a lot of books. They're continuously having new discourses, expanding ideas, and refining their knowledge. All of this is constantly stored upon more and more various tomes and books. Too bad they don't have a means to store all this data in some sort of convenient electrical form, perhaps like a computer for easy access on some sort of network of computers. But to be fair, it's not like something like this has existed that they could study and repurpose, or that there's some industry already set up that could help them do this. Cough, cough. Though I guess if they were to do that, it would be far less impressive than a literal 6-story bookshelf. Anywho, they sell a lot of knowledge, because Sharlayan is basically a giant university, selling knowledge in books. Highly, highly sought after books. Very, very expensive, highly, highly sought after books. Yeah, it's a university. Sharlayan has the highest rate of education on all of Heidelin. And yes, they do accept students from other nations. But there are many, many, many subjects that they refuse to teach the outsiders. And books on certain subjects that they refuse to allow outsiders to see. These are subjects that could potentially be dangerous in the wrong hands, though cynical me says it's also on subjects that can be very lucrative, like perhaps figuring out how to make the Aether ticket a single button press, or how to make it possible to change glamour plates anywhere in the world. Yoshi, please. And now, a quick word on religion in Sharlayan. Sharlayans don't really give religion much thought. The guardian deity of the city is Phallic. Phalliac. Him being the god of knowledge and all, so it makes sense. Beyond that, they have a very strict pray to whoever you want policy. So, yeah, not much to say about religious beliefs because they don't have much to say on it either. So next up, their diet. Sharlayan food. Man, how do I even begin? Sharlayan food is the worst food ever. Depressingly bad. Funny enough, Sharlayans do actually create amazingly delicious meals. Potentially even the best meals in the world. But when these are created, it is to study the meal only, not for consumption. They make great food to stare at it. Guess they're all Instagrammers. Though I'm sure they probably sneak bites in here and there, because, as mentioned, their actual food for eating is awful. Sharlayan food is specially made to be everything the body needs in perfect portions. Quite literally the perfect meal in terms of dietary needs. The only problem is that they didn't give any thought to taste or texture, which ranges from bland to I'd rather lick sandpaper, and taste ranging from eating a fistful of sand to licking your father's armpits. That really is the range of excitement Sharlayan food produces. Next up, Sharlayan Astrology. So, fun fact for those who don't play Astrologian, it comes from Sharlayan. It was created in the year 250-ish by a Sharlayan researcher named Leufon. It was then taught, along with a bunch of other things, in the Sharlayan colony in the Dravanian hinterlands. But with the exodus of the Sharlayans from Eorzea, it left many students without masters or teachers. Luckily for us, one of these students, a certain Ishgardian Janequard de Durande, was a pupil of Sharlayan astrology. He now focuses on spreading it instead of the dominant Ishgardian astrology in Ishgard. He is, or was, the only Sharlayan astrologian in Ishgard, until a certain warrior of light took up the job. Speaking of the Dravanian hinterlands colony, that's a thing the Sharlayans did. In the year 1311, scholars of Sharlayan crossed the sea and landed in the Dravanian hinterlands, where they discovered very deep natural caverns. The Sharlayans judged that this site was ideal for observing and studying the Ethereal Sea, which is basically the center of the planet, the quote, heart of Hydaelyn, and thus they built a small outpost and the anti-tower just to do that. Anywho, time passed and the small outpost very quickly grew into a very large settlement, as all academics from Sharlayan who wanted to venture into Eorzea and beyond for study or whatever reason would always first travel to this settlement. Afterwards, many would just remain in the settlement for long-term research and teaching. Eventually, rumors of this community of learned men spread all across Eorzea, and soon students from all over the continent began to move to the settlement. They sought to learn from the Sharlayans, and the Sharlayans welcomed them. In 1361, 50 years after it was founded as a mere outpost, it had grown to such an extent that the forums officially proclaimed it as a colony. Thus, the colony became the sixth city-state of Eorzea, named Sharlayan, and the first Sharlayan was renamed to Old Sharlayan. But we kinda know something went wrong here. Good old Garleans. They invaded and captured Alamigo in 1557, and the Sharlayans saw the Garleans as a threat to their very way of life. Surprise, surprise, right? A city-state that abhors and refuses to go to war, not liking a city-state that invades other nations? Wow, shocker. Anywho, they sent out an ambassador to Garlemald to ask them to please leave us alone. Why don't we just have peace? Garlemald ignored their pleas. Also, shocker. Now, knowing they're not safe from Garlemald's advances, Fortunat Leveneur and the faction of the forum he leads voted to abandon the Dravanian colonies. What followed was 5 years of preparation to evacuate the entire population and move the various texts, equipment and supplies to the northern Isle of Ham. Thus, in year 1562, the once great Sharlayan colony became the goblin-infested ruin and cheese factory we know today. Now, some of the things we've learnt from the Eorzean perspective could be proven to be false. Who knows? But at least now you know everything we do know up to this point. But, for now, goodbye my friends, and have a great day.